Hello, this is Matthew with Disarm Harm. I am kind of taking a little bit of a waylay around things, and I wanted to do a bit of a study on some Kabalistic thought, and we're gonna get started. So, the rose amongst the thorns, the rose among the thorns. Um, for those of you that don't know, the Kabbalah is an ancient Israeli esoteric teaching. It is a non-dual teaching, and we're going to see a lot of that. If you don't know what non-dualism is, I encourage you to reach out, look at some videos, understand some stuff, and I'm going to relate it to a couple of things that exist within Western society, that have always existed within Western philosophy, that have always existed within Western thought. And I'm just going to kind of talk about some of the things that have advanced humanity and taken away from humanity, and how that all ties beautifully into this. So, Reza Hezekiah opened his discourse and said, Rabbi Hezekiah, by the way, is the one who invented the Kabbalistic text, the Zohar, which is like it means antenna or receiver or companion. It's like an antenna to the spiritual realm, to the highest possible consciousness. Reza Hezekiah, his discourses, and said, "It is written, as a rose among the thorns, so is my beloved amongst my daughters." Songs 2, verse 2. Who is this rose? This refers to the Knesset Israel, which is the community of Israel, the collective soul roots of Israel, Malchut. And thinking about Malchut is like a sovereignty. It's the last of the 10 divine Sephirot, or the spheres, and their corresponding mortal Midot acts as a transitory link to the lower world. So, tattooed on my arm is the Kabbalistic tree of life. Very important to Jewish culture, very important to the Jewish people, revolutionary to the Chabad Lubavitch and Hasidic sects of Judaism, specifically in their writings and their understandings and their commentaries on the Ten Yiddick or the Ten Yiddim. But yeah, for there is one level of a rose, and there's another level of a rose. 2 levels. Just as a rose, which is found amidst the thorns, has within it the colors red and white, also Knesset Israel has within her both judgment and loving kindness. So within the community of Israel, there is judgment and there is loving kindness. And just as a rose has in it 13 petals, so too the community of Israel has within her 13 paths of mercy, which surround her from all sides. This is the Zohar, into paragraph 1. It is a fundamental principle of the Kabbalah that all of the things God creates in the lower realm, i.e., this physical existence, are expressions of their spiritual roots, forces, and divine archetypes in the upper realms. Therefore, the extent that it is possible, we may see and use part of the physical world as a parable, which is a story. It is almost a riddle designed as a story, designed as a lesson. Yeshua HaMashiach, or Jesus the Messiah, in the Christian faith, had the belief that I and the Father are one. What he is speaking to is some things that we're going to cover in some of these spiritual texts. Therefore, to the extent that it is possible, we may see and use parts of the physical world as a parable for different aspects of divinity. In its opening discourse, the Holy Zohar explains how the Shekhinah, otherwise known as the Divine Presence, referred to the community of Israel. The Shekhinah is the manifestation of the Divine Presence in this world. It is God's feminine manifestation. So the Shekhinah glory is the Bema seat, which is what we end up seeing specifically in the not really the Bema seat, but the book of Exodus, where the essence of God, the power of God, descended upon the earth. otherwise known as the divine presence, or referred to as Knesset Israel, or the community of Israel, is compared to a rose that has two colors, white and red, within it. So the Holy Zohar explains how the feminine energy, or the feminine divine of God, otherwise known as the divine presence, referred to as the community of Israel. So this divine presence is God descending and being with the community of Israel. It's compared to a rose that has two colors, white and red, within it. In addition, the rose has 13 petals and 5 sepals surrounding her to protect from the thorns. Similarly, the Shekinah possesses two general qualities, loving kindness and judgment, corresponding to white and red, respectively. She receives 13 qualities of mercy from above, channeled from God, in a way which will be explained, represented by the 13 petals, and also 5 loving kindness, represented by the 5 petals, which guard her from the dark forces, represented by the thorns. So here we see the Zohar unlocking the secret to a supernatural root with the reflective key of the rose. Rabbi Hezekiah, the community Demescalizer, explains that the Zohar chooses to start with a lesson by Rabbi Hezekiah because his name hints to us a message. Hezekiah can be read as Chezek Ya'ah, which means strength of the divine name Ya'ah, one of the divine names of God. The message is that when a person embarks on the voyage of traversing the vast ocean of Kabbalah, he is assured divine assistance. The name Ya'ah is used in reference to spiritual energies above nature. The divine energy will be given to the student as he delves into the supernatural secrets. Quick quote: when a person embarks on the voyage of traversing the vast ocean of Kabbalah, he is assured divine assistance. Opened, this term issued frequently in the Zohar to indicate that the teacher opened himself up as a vessel to the experience of the spiritual. What they're doing inside of this text, by the way, as we go through this, when we read this, this is the actual passage that is found within the Zohar. And then what they do is they end up analyzing specific words and what that actually means and how that actually breaks down. And then more importantly, how it relates to the Jewish holy text, the Torah. The Christian church knows it formerly as the Pentateuch, Penta being 5, which are the 613, which contain within them the 613 commandments of God. It is written. Normally, the Zohar excludes this phrase and just says, Rabbi so-and-so opened, followed by the verse. The message here is that we must write these words on the heart. Rabbi Hezekiah's opening teaching is on the fundamental importance in helping us cope with our present situation. By taking this lesson to heart, we show that this teaching is not merely an intellectual one, but it is also an emotional one. And this is one of my favorite messages of this opening passage, is that we must really feel the pain of exile and use it to fire our efforts towards redemption. You know, one of the most revolutionary teachings that I had ever taken the time to read was Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, where he ended up surviving a Nazi concentration camp. And in the Nazi concentration camp, he noticed that there were two kinds of prisoners. There was the first kind of prisoner that said, amongst us, with all of this suffering going on, what is the point of being alive? And then the other kind of prisoner, the first prisoner, by the way, would oftentimes die frequently because they couldn't find meaning even in the suffering. And the second kind of prisoner used to say, or would say, with all of this suffering going on around us, we have to find meaning within the suffering, otherwise what is the point of the suffering? And it just reminds me of this beautiful lesson, and that it is an ancient lesson that we end up seeing in a Kabalistic tradition, tying itself into a Jewish concentration camp, which ultimately ended up going on to becoming logotherapy in the world of psychology. And in this logotherapy, what it helps us do is it helps us find suffering and our meaning. Frankl ended up teaching that really the question that we are to answer is what is the meaning of my life, what is the purpose of my life, is actually an assignment. It is not something that we asked. It is something that is oftentimes asked of us. So we see here, by taking this lesson to heart, we show that his teaching is not merely an intellectual one, as in the mind, but it's also an emotional one, and that we must really feel the pain of exile and use it to fire our efforts towards redemption. By opening ourselves up in the same way as Reza Hezekiah, we can discover the inner truth which is engraved upon the heart. It is of great significance that the start of this section of the Zohar, which is a commentary on the Torah, should begin by quoting not from the Torah, but from the Song of Songs of King Solomon. The space between the cherubim and the Holy of Holies in the temple is the place of the closest, most intimate relationship between God and his people. This level of relationship is expressed in the Song of Songs, a love song pouring out the intimacies of the heart. By opening up its revelation of the supernatural mysteries with this quote, the Zohar hints to us that the relationship is its driving theme. The relationship is the driving theme of the book, that is the antenna and the unity, the common unity, the community of God. By opening up its revelation of the supernatural mysteries with this quote, the Zohar hints to us that this relationship is its divine theme. With this, we can understand why the Zoharic system of giving over its knowledge revolves around the masculine-feminine relationship. This same relationship pervades the Song of Songs in its every verse. Also, the fact that the Zohar starts by quoting from the Song of Songs hints to us that it has a special goal to reveal the inner level of the Torah, which expresses itself in the form of song. The inner level of the Torah, which expresses itself in the form of song. So the community of Israel is actually the collective soul roots of Israel. So if you think about this, we have the chesed and then we have the collective soul roots, right? So we have these roots at the bottom. The term used throughout the Zohar refers to the Shekinah, the presence of God that is amongst us, the presence of God that is amongst all of us, the entire community. Why are these two seemingly disparate concepts, the collection of fragments in the indivisible whole, used interchangeably? Visualize a mountain from which small rocks are hewn. They become separate pieces, each one rooted, conceptually and spiritually, in the mountain from which they are hewn. Similarly, the souls are, as it were, pieces hewn out of this glory. Malchut, in brief, God, who is infinite and ungraspable, literally ungraspable. And this is important in modern psychology very specifically because how are we to grasp our minds? How are we to grasp the thing that is the antenna to the thing that is our creator? Oftentimes I describe it in the philosophy of mind that our minds can no more grasp themselves than our hand can grasp itself. It's simply not built for it. Primarily because it is the antenna, it is the Zohar, it is the union between what is divine, the consciousness, our known consciousness. So in brief, God, who is infinite and ungraspable, expresses himself and relates to man through his supernatural attributes, which he also created. Malchut is both the last of the 10 Sephirot and the vessel through which the other 9 express themselves in the world. The results in the revelation of the kingship of God. Malchut is alluded to the term Knesset Yisrael, which also connects with the Shekinah, as mentioned above, and therefore the student can absorb the idea of Malchut through the filter of the collective soul roots of Israel, of the community. In terms of this discourse, this is meant to bring out to us that the revelation of the divine kingship depends on the community of Israel. All of this is symbolized by a rose. For there is one level of a rose, and there is another level of a rose. The Arizal was the first person to really reveal the deep secrets of the Zohar from an understanding of its esoteric text. He explains as follows: this phrase hints to 2 states of Malchut, a higher state and a lower state, and there is nothing wrong with this. Before we can understand, and I know the Western idea is that higher, lower is superior and greater and superior and lesser. Here's the thing. If you understand non-dual reasoning, if you understand and live the non-dual way, you're going to understand a couple of different things as you go through your journey. And one of the things that my mentor constantly reminds me of, and he's a beautiful soul, he says that if you have to tell people you're enlightened, you're not enlightened. If you have to tell people that you possess something, you are awake, you are woke, and they are not, you are not awake. The Tao Te Ching inside of Eastern philosophy says that a Zen that goes by the name Zen, or a Zen that is named Zen, is not Zen. The profound nature of this quote is that the minute we end up trying to apply language, and we see Wittgenstein who ended up saying this, but the minute we end up applying language to something, we immediately make it real outside of ourselves. We make it dual. So if you use the words awake, by the use of your word, you are utilizing your judgment conscious to place a word on something. The reason I argue, and I might be wrong, so feel free to open up the discourse on this. The reason I argue this is because the minute we end up applying a word to something, we ultimately end up applying a judgment to it. And because we are applying a judgment to it, we are using our judgment conscious, our ego conscious, as Jung and Freud would end up saying. We use our ego conscious to apply a word to it. The Shekinah derives the Hebrew word Shekin, which means dwell. God dwelled amongst us. There is El, the first person to really reveal the deep secrets of Zohar. We're going to go back here, sorry. Two states of Malkut, a higher and lower state. Before we can understand the explanation of this verse, we must explain briefly the concept of Shekinah. So we're going to get into that. The word Shekinah derives from the Hebrew word Shekin, which means to dwell, or to dwell amongst us. We see it specifically in a Shekinah glory, like I said in the book of Exodus. This helps to explain the English term presence, as well as Shekinah as the state of God's presence manifest in the world, his immanence. The Kabalistic teaching is that there are two general areas where this occurs: the upper realm and the lower realm. The rabbis teach that God created the world because he wanted to dwell in the lower realm. He created the spiritual realm as a pathway to reach the lower realm, so much so that he wanted his presence to be manifest in the lower realm in the same manner as in the upper realm. In this way, his omniscience becomes apparent everywhere, thus revealing his absolute unity. His presence above is manifest in Bina and is therefore called the upper Shekinah, or the upper rose. His presence below is manifest in Malkut, or the lower rose. The spiritual realm is beyond place. However, as discussions about the nature of this realm include this concept, place needs to be understood. Within this context, closeness depends upon similarity and not distance. When the intensity of the revolution in Malkut rises towards that of Bina, the holiness, this is called Malkut ascending to Bina, as we ascend, this is the higher state of Malkut that the Zohar is referring to, and this gives us a first step in understanding of spiritual practice. Let us try and understand how the mechanism of Malkut ascending works. The intensity of revelation within Malkut can increase from above or below. As above, so below. An example of this increase from above is the close proximity to God that we are able to feel on Shabbat. This is really a gift from God which allows the revelation of the divine to build throughout the day. And Shabbat is the holy day of rest. It is the day where we do nothing and we are nothing and we are one with God. God's presence is here on earth. It allows us to do nothing but be absorbed inside of our holy scriptures, inside of our holy texts. And it's such a beautiful concept, except for the fact that our language tends to interfere with it. But if we do nothing and we are one with God in our eternal oneness, how do we ultimately... Well, this is how we rest. This is what we do. This is really a gift from God which allows the revelation of the divine to build throughout the day. Malkut fills with more divine light and thus gradually rises to a higher state. This is somewhat like a hot air balloon, and the more you use the burners, the higher you rise. An example of this increase from below is the spiritual work which we do on this earth by doing good deeds, thus bringing a flow of positive energy to the world in general. Each act when we perform has the potential to add another quantum level of divine light to Malkut, thus propelling it up to its higher state. This can be likened to the simple quantum model of the atom when the right packet of energy zaps an electron, and this is quantum mechanics. So each act we perform, it will jump straight up to a higher predefined orbit around the nucleus, which is really fascinating. Each act we perform has the potential to add another quantum level of divine light to Malkut, thus propelling it up to its higher state. This can be likened to the simple quantum model of the atom when the right package of energy zaps an electron. The electron itself, when it gets zapped, it will jump up to a higher predefined orbit around the nucleus. Let us now review the scriptural verse, a rose amidst the thorns. It connotes the Shekhinah Malkut in its lower state. My beloved refers to the Malkut in its higher state, even though beloved usually refers to the holiness, the presence, the consciousness that is of God. When Malkut rises to Bina, it too can be so called in accordance with the Zoharic principle, like Mother Bina, like Daughter Malkut, like Mother Bina, like Daughter Malkut, again indicating the divine interconnectedness that belongs to all of us. Until this point, we were explaining the two states of Malkut in the terms of spheres, the Sephirot. The next step is to see what this means in terms of the man's soul, and this is where this gets really freaking cool if you've been following me along. The verse states, "And the Lord created man in his image," Gen 1:27. The great Kabalistic principle defined from this is that just as God has 10 divine attributes, so does the soul. And further, the workings of the Sephirot, just as God has 10 divine attributes, so does the soul. I'm going to repeat that because it's important, right? Again, it's alchemic teachings, as above, so below. And furthermore, the workings of the soul, Sephirot, can be parallelized to the mechanisms of the Sephirot above. From this comes the guiding principle expressed in the verse, "And you shall walk in his ways." As the rabbis explain, just as he is merciful, so we too must be merciful. Just as he is full of loving kindness, so too must we be full of loving kindness, and so on. And we tend to walk in his ways when we are full of loving kindness in this way, and so on. Malkut is the lowest Sephirah, which is the vessel that receives from all those above and brings them to expression. The reason that it is a manifestation of kingship is that the unified working of the Sephirot together show God's hallmark on the underlying creative power and providence, and hence to his sovereignty and rulership in terms of the soul. We can explain Malkut as self-realization, the vessel through which the aspects of the self establish themselves. When a person expresses himself in action, all the Sephirot, all of the spheres of his souls, whether openly or in a hidden manner, they come together. This is an example of the Sephirot coming to Malkut and expressing through her. There are two ways that this can happen. Sometimes you find yourself doing something with great enthusiasm, driven by a crystal clear image in your heart and brain of all of the exciting ideas behind your action. This is Malkut ascending to Bina. At other times, you may do the same thing without vigor, unable to muster that dynamic vision, your mind and heart clouded by distractions, your feelings lying dormant, and this corresponds to the Malkut in its constricted state below. And this is not inferior, you guys. I want to really, really stress that this is not inferior, that even in consciousness above or below, we are all one, that is united. From the verse, we see that, in a sense, both states are equal. As a rose, so is my beloved. This teaches us that one should not withhold himself from serving God, even when he is not inspired to serve God. God knows that one goes through ups and downs, and he derives pleasure from our service in both states. He derives pleasure from our service in both states. In a sense, then, we see a great aspect of our relationship with God. We said before that God created the world because he wanted to dwell in the lower realm. It's all very well to love God when you're flying on a spiritual high, but what happens when you touch down and have to maintain the relationship through the daily grind of existence? The true test of such a relationship is whether it can withstand the pressures of bad times. When two people have a deep and loving relationship, it expresses itself in absolute fidelity in the bad times as well as the good. And when it maintains itself through the difficulties, it gives further strength to those bonds of love. Where do I want to begin? Eastern philosophy speaks of an allegory of an elephant. And I want you to think of an elephant as the higher state, the entire elephant as the higher state. And then each person, as a collective part, is grasping one part of the elephant. And this is the lower state, the grasping of the one part of the elephant, and not really being able to see the greater picture of the elephant. And there is, again, nothing wrong with this. This is not a judgment. I need to assure this, and I'm going to share something with individuals in regards to where my perceptions are on this and my understandings are on this today in regards to another really famous passage. But there's the greater elephant, and then there's the lesser portion, which is a part of the elephant that we see. And oftentimes we are just blind, grasping portions of the elephant, and then arguing with the guy beside us that our portion of the elephant is a knee, or it is a broomstick, or it is we are arguing with one another over what we think it might be. We are arguing with one another over the part that we are grasping because our eyes are closed and we are blind. And we argue with each other. And again, there is nothing wrong with this. The learning how to argue with each other is a part of the greater part of the elephant so that we can see the larger picture. That's the Eastern philosopher thinking. Western philosophy, upon which Descartes founded his writings, Meditations on First Philosophy, ultimately came to the conclusion, and I'm going to be honest, it's kind of a dangerous conclusion because it is full what is known as ego identification of I think, therefore I am. The argument of I think, therefore I am is placed amongst dualistic thinkers, which again, I would argue is the lower state. And again, nothing wrong with the lower state. As a matter of fact, I'm currently studying higher and lower state because I think this is important, and I'll argue why it's important in a second. I think, therefore I am. René Descartes posed that it could be a brain, we could be nothing more than a brain in a vat. You know, the Matrix theory. We could be nothing more than a brain in a vat. And our brain in a vat is simply grasping the creation of what might be an evil demon of the world around us. That there could be some grand scientist or grand controller zapping the brain and giving us the perceptions of the world around us. And Descartes goes on to argue that because generally the perceptions of the world around us are actually really quite good, he says that the grand controller is probably not a demon. It is something else. And to that I argue it is the greater elephant, it is the greater consciousness. It is the Shekinah glory that is dwelling amongst us. It is God. And that is where Descartes and I will agree. Where Descartes and I will disagree is specifically amongst the I think, therefore I am, the dualistic thought. Descartes stopped at identifying with thinking. He didn't understand in his own writings that the greater creator, the greater thing that was guiding the perceptions was in fact God, was in fact good. But that oftentimes what ultimately happens is we get so caught up in our thinking that we fail to realize that we are to act in loving kindness for the greater good. Nothing wrong with this. Again, it's just a higher state and a lower state. It is not superior or inferior. There is love and kindness from God in all of our states, and this is so, so, so vital. Another line of thinking I want to touch base with you on is specifically in relation to what is called Plato's Allegory of the Cave, and there are many videos on YouTube in terms of Plato's Allegory of the Cave. But Plato's Allegory of the Cave ends up going on to demonstrate an allegory of prisoners that are chained to a chair or to a wall. And what they are doing is they are looking at a wall. They are arguing over the shadows of the wall. They are arguing over which part of the elephant they are blindly grasping onto. Beautifully, in this argument, one of the prisoners ends up becoming free. And in this prisoner's freedom, he ends up leaving the cave. And when he leaves the cave, he goes out and he discovers things. He discovers the real things that are casting the shadows on the wall. I should add that the prisoners being chained to the wall is to prevent the prisoners from actually turning around when they are trying to see what is casting the shadow on the wall. As a matter of fact, they are so busy arguing over the shadows on the wall that they fail to recognize that they aren't actually in chains. They merely think they are. So we see this malchut, this lower level, this cave, this dwelling. And we've got these objects that are behind us, and there's a torch, and it is casting shadows on the wall. And one of the prisoners realizes that, oh hey, holy crap, I actually don't have chains on me. And he turns around, and he walks out of the cave. And in walking out of the cave, he ends up discovering that, holy crap, there's light out here. It's extremely bright. And he goes on this grand, wonderful world of discovery. He goes on discovering the things around him. And he's looking around and he's excited and he's looking at the trees and the birds and the forest and the skies and the bees and eventually, with time, his eyes adjust enough, and it is painful, but his eyes adjust enough that he is looking at the light. He is looking directly at the sun. The one lesson, and the thing that I might add about this lesson, is that once you've reached this state of light, Plato then goes on to say that we have a responsibility to go back into the cave. And the thing is that when the heroine of this allegory goes back into the cave, what he experiences is a issue with the prisoners themselves who have yet to realize that the chains aren't actually attached to them, and they're still arguing over the shadows on the wall. They're still arguing over the portion of the elephant. And they say, you're nuts. That can't be so, because they've grown so accustomed to arguing over the shadows on the wall that they think that they are themselves skilled at arguing over the shadows on the wall. And this is where it gets frustrating for me, specifically when I'm talking to people within spiritual communities, is that they're unwilling to go back into the cave. Or worse yet, they think that because they have attained a taste of this higher state, that this higher state is somehow the superior state, and they don't have a responsibility to go back into the cave. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. I just got out of a cycle of going back into the cave. I was intentionally trying to trigger the ever-living shit out of people inside of my Facebook page to assess their emotional states and see what I could do, and holy crap, it's violent in there. And that's okay. The thing is that what we often do is that when we try to reveal to people that there are higher states or lower states, and we say to them, hey, there's this higher sense of learning, and we have a higher sense of wisdom, one of the sephirot, one of the spheres that we have to overcome and transcend in our own journeys, that when we have this higher sense of wisdom, they get violent, and that scares people who are in the higher states. So what do? They stay in the perception of their higher state. They stay there. And in staying there, they end up actually just remaining in the lower state. It becomes a new cave. We can stay there, but if we're staying there for the purposes of, I have something you don't have, doo-da, we are in fact casting judgment. And that is the purpose of the second portion of Plato's Allegory of the Cave. And that we have a responsibility to go back into the cave and free prisoners from their chains, free prisoners from the argument of the shadow, free prisoners from the argument of the elephant. And I see this a lot of the time when people end up attaining a taste of the light. Another Sephirot, another sphere, and there is again nothing wrong with this. This is the beautiful part of the journey as we ascend and descend, ascend and descend, is that they won't do it. And in not doing it, they themselves have just found another cave. You tend to notice that amongst the spiritual community specifically, it's just spiritualists arguing with each other over what is spiritual. And in their argument, they fail to realize that the argument itself, through the processing of what psychology calls first language processing, through the processing of the language of the argument, they fail to realize that they are simply in nothing more but another cave. And again, there is nothing wrong with this. This is a part of the journey. This is a beautiful part of the journey. This is the steps to Jacob's ladder, the steps to Jacob's ladder, that we will ascend and descend frequently. We will wake up and we will fall asleep, and we will wake up and we will fall asleep. Don't get me wrong, my descent into the cave this time to go and talk to the prisoners in the cave ultimately ended up putting me back to sleep and arguing with the prisoners over matters of shadow. Now, you can argue with the prisoners over matters of shadow, but you have to argue with the prisoners over the matter of shadow through what Socrates called the elenchus. And it is a matter of deductive thought to help them come to higher states of understanding. Because oftentimes they identify with these stupid words. They identify with words like enlightenment, words like enlightened, words like empath, words like empathy. And in the formation and the creation and the use of those words, they argue over the definition of those words. I did it on my Facebook feed not too long ago, where I had a dialogue asking a friend what he thought empath meant. And the beautiful thing is that I pointed out to him that nobody in that comment section had any idea or any consistency about the word empath. And in arguing over the word and the definition of empath, they were arguing for the shadow on the wall. They were arguing for that part of the elephant. Now, empath, I would argue, if I'm to argue for the shadow on the wall, is to understand someone's suffering. Empathy is not something we feel. Empathy is something we do as we attempt to understand someone's suffering. Empathy is our way of coming out of the cave and then going back into the cave, knowing that there are prisoners in there, knowing that they're going to be violent, knowing that they're going to be angry, knowing that they're going to argue with you over which portion of the elephant that they have, and doing the work with them anyways to slowly bring them up to the path of realizing that they are, in fact, arguing over the same part of the greater elephant. Now, the thing is, and the reason why I'm not worried about this, is because a part of our journey is to ascend and descend along the Sephirot. A part of our journey is to understand another sphere of the Sephirot. It is to understand deeply the words that form the definitions, that form the judgments of our oneness, of our united divinity. And this is so valuable. It's such a valuable teaching. But the important thing is, and I want people to remember this, if anything, you think you are enlightened, and you are instead standing there saying, I'm awake and they are not, you are not enlightened. A Zen that is called Zen is not Zen. And we have a responsibility to instead say, hey, I have something you don't have, to dive back into the cave, to go back into the cave at the risk of our own sleeping, at the risk of our own suffering once again. And we saw it, that suffering, that the pain of suffering is oftentimes what bears the fruit. One of the tattoos on my hand here, in Buddhist teaching specifically, is that the lily grows, the lotus grows from the mud of suffering. And then I put Christ above it. The lotus grows from the price of suffering. The thing is that we have to be willing to inflict the suffering upon ourselves by going back into the cave if we are to ascend and descend the suffering of our own consciousness. And this is valuable. So if you think you're awake and you believe you've attained a higher state of consciousness, what I want you to do is I want you to go back into the cave and I want you to argue over the shadows on the cave wall. I want you to go into the lower state. And the reason I would ask that you go into the lower state is because in that suffering, in that argument, you are going to come to understand not only your own higher states, but you yourself are going to become, well, really, you're going to do good deeds amongst the community. You're going to do good works amongst the community that then goes on to free prisoners from their own chains and allows them to ascend with you out of the cave. Those are just kind of my thinkings and some of the things that I've learned over the last semester and some of the things that I'm thinking about and how it ties back into the greatest spiritual work of, the first spiritual work of centuries of thought amongst the Jewish people. We'll talk to you soon. Have a good day.